Now, the soul, in my understanding, is where your prarabdha karma abides. Your prarabdha karma is the karma you have brought forward from your past incarnations. If you believe in reincarnation and that the soul evolves from life to life, it means when Akash was born, Akash wasn't born with an empty slate. Or when Apurva was born, she wasn't born with a clean slate. Apurva brought with her karmas, karmic impressions, karmic baggage from her past life, positive and negative. And when Akash was born, he wasn't born with a clean slate. Nobody's born with a clean slate. We bring with us karmic baggage, positive and negative. So for example, there are human beings that are born with unique gifts and talents. Some people are very gifted with music, so you have some musical geniuses at 6, 7, 8 years old that can play a musical instrument as if they've been studying for 20 years, but they had no time to learn it. And this means this gift or this talent was obviously carried forward from a previous incarnation. Or there are individuals who are born with traumas, traumatic fears, or neurosis or traumas from a past life. And they bring fears and problems with them which were the source of which is not in this life. So the soul, I'm trying to describe this, the soul is the receptacle or the container of our prarabdha karma. The soul is the retainer or the container of our prarabdha karmas. But also, I thought a lot about this, and I understand the soul to be where our moral capacity abides as an individual human being. So for example, we all have different degrees of moral capacity. That when we're tested, in our relationship to money, our relationship to power, our relationship to sex, there's always big moral questions come up in relationship to money and to power, to sexuality. Do you all understand what I'm talking about? So there's a moral proclivity or we all have different kinds of moral capacities in relationship to money, power, and sexuality. And also, I believe, in relationship to our spiritual insights. So for example, some people, when they have a spiritual awakening or they have an enlightenment experience, this awakening to a higher state of consciousness, though, this awakening to the enlightened awareness, awakens in them a kind of a moral sensibility, a moral or ethical sensibility in relationship to life that was triggered by the spiritual awakening. So sometimes we find, for example, that people who have had have experienced higher states of consciousness or deeper states of consciousness, people who have had deeper experiences of the true self, or profound experiences of in evolutionary enlightenment we call the authentic self. Often we find they express a greater moral sensitivity. There's a greater moral sensitivity. So for example, that would mean maybe their relationship to eating flesh. Maybe they would have more of a reluctance to eating flesh, to eating meat. Maybe they would feel greater caution around sexuality. They'd feel more cautious because of the moral implications of engaging in sexuality. There's always moral implications. They would be more sensitive to the moral implications of sexual activity. They would be more sensitive to the whole issues of power, because many different men and women in different ways can be easily seduced by power. And so someone who's had a spiritual awakening or awakened to true self and or the authentic self might feel more sensitivity and more cautious, more of a sense of caution around the dangers of being addicted to power, dangers of being addicted to power. Also questions around relationship to money. Money and power are very closely related. So often when people have spiritual awakenings and awaken to a higher state of consciousness, awaken to true self, authentic self, they experience a greater sensitivity around these kinds of issues. So it's my belief and my understanding that each individual has a different moral capacity. So Vijay has a different moral capacity to Akash, and Apurva has a different moral capacity than Abhishek. We all have a different moral capacity. And so in my understanding, in the way that I teach, it's my understanding and I believe that our moral capacity in relationship to spirituality, money, sex, and power resides in our souls. What I would call the soul strength. It depends on the strength of the souls, the strength of the soul. So how powerful or strong the soul is in the way that I teach, which means our moral capacity, our moral strength, or moral integrity as a human being, our moral strength and moral integrity as a human being, we could determine resides in the soul. And not everybody has the same kind of moral capacity. So for example, great historical figures like, for example, Mahatma Gandhi, for example, had a great moral capacity. Everybody would agree he was a great soul. To me, when someone says, like, for example, Mahatma Gandhi was a great soul, we can understand that being a great soul in his case was determined by his extraordinary moral virtue. So a virtuous man and a virtuous woman, a woman of great virtue, a man of great virtue, is somebody who, in my understanding, is morally virtuous, is morally and ethically has great strength, which in this teaching we'd say their strength, they're very strong in their soul. Their soul is very powerful. And remember, I'm including in my definition of soul, nature of the soul, is our moral capacity plus our prarabdha karma. Prarabdha karma, positive prarabdha karma, negative prarabdha karma. So we want to say, in my interpretation of soul, we'd say prarabdha karma plus moral virtue, capacity for moral virtue in relationship to power, sex, money, and spirituality, presides or is found in what we would call the soul of the individual. So the ego is made up of fears and desires. The ego is made up of fears and desires. The ego is made up of fears and desires. The ego is our personal identity. It's who I believe myself to be as a personality, who Akash believes himself to be as a personality, who Apurva considers herself to be as a personality. Apurva's fears and desires, her beliefs, her conditioned beliefs, her conditioned ways of thinking, her conditioned desires, her conditioned fears, which come from her personal life experience, plus her cultural background. So Apurva's conditioned fears and conditioned desires, conditioned beliefs that come from her personal life experience and her cultural background or cultural context. This is her ego. This is the ego or her personality or personal self. So what we're calling the personality or the ego and personality, I'm using interchangeably. When we say ego or personality, we're saying this is purely personal. It's purely personal. But the soul is, it would be, if we're speaking about a Purva or Abhishek or any individual, but Purva's soul is a deeper part of her. It's a deeper part of her than the ego. My soul is a deeper part of me than my ego. Your soul is a deeper part of yourself than your ego. So what resides in your soul, and I'm repeating, is your prarabdha karmas, positive and negative, and your capacities for moral virtue in relationship to money, power, sex, and spirituality.